The 2012 presidential election series, Middle Class Taxpayers Must Pay More, Awakening the Middle Class Giant, a video book presentation. A video book is a narrated electronic book that can be streamed or played on your computer or in a DVD player. As a book, a video book is not intended to entertain but to educate and inform. This video book is by and for middle class taxpayers, a production of the Public Square Today, hearing all sides, following one truth. FBI warning: the information contained is copyrighted and offenders will be prosecuted. A swing state middle class taxpayer CFO CPA's perspective. This election is about the middle-class taxpayer and what he or she will pay in the future. I'm a CPA and I've looked at the numbers. The math is simple and the ideas are easy to follow. I will prove to you in 3 20-minute presentations that your tax rates must increase 2 to 4 times. The numbers could not be any plainer or more clear. If you earn between $75,000 and $250,000 a year, you will be particularly hard hit because our nation's economic problems have reached a magnitude that prevents resolution from any other tax-paying group. I will prove to you that as a middle-class taxpayer, your economic future, not anyone else's, is on the line. To cast your vote on November 6th in the best interest of yourself and your loved ones, you need to be certain you know whether the following 3 points are true, almost as if your life depended upon it, because your take-home pay sure does. First, the way to resolve the debt and deficit is to close big oil, Wall Street, and big business loopholes and deductions, or corporate jet loopholes and deductions, or to make America's wealthiest citizens pay their fair share through mechanisms similar to the Warren Buffett rule. Second, the current economic recession, debt, and deficit escalation are the result of failed policies of the past, primarily Bush's presidency, which favored Wall Street, big oil, big business, and cost Americans trillions of dollars in lost wealth. Third, energy price escalation is resolved through American energy independence, but the future is clean, green energies, now, solar and wind, etc. In this second segment of Part 2, we want to rightly understand what failed policies created the debt and deficit. This is a must if we are going to rightly choose between presidential candidates on November 6th. If we as middle-class taxpayers are to resolve the deficit and debt issues facing our nation, then we need to understand how large the debt is, how much larger it will get, and what type of taxation or economic growth is required to prevent the flat tire from recurring in the future for ourselves and upcoming generations. We address the middle-class taxation required if our national economy is unable to grow sufficiently. Now let's briefly examine the national debt. In this slide, we provided 2 charts. The top chart is a graph of defense spending in red relative to non-defense spending, of which entitlements represent 2/3, in blue. Notice defense spending has been declining since 1960. In the bottom graph, we have defense spending as a percentage of GDP, the yellow line, and a percentage of total federal outlays, the red line. Again, defense spending has been flat, consistently hovering around 20% of governmental outlays since 1990, or over the past 22 years, and has been less than 10% of GDP over the same period. In this dual y-axis graph from 1940 to 2016 with projections from 2012 to 2016, the left y-axis corresponds to the yellow line and the right y-axis to the remaining plot lines. The debt is the yellow line, the red line is defense spending, and the blue is entitlement spending. The data is plotted in constant $2,000 to remove the effects of inflation, which is the more technically correct way of observing the trend in the data over time because it removes the contamination of purchasing power fluctuations. Notice the 2 lines that move parallel to one another over time. They are the yellow and the blue lines, the U.S. debt and entitlement spending. It is mathematically impossible to blame the debt on defense spending. You can't get there by adding the numbers. Finally, note the red shaded box that spans from years 2000 to 2011. It shows the increase in the blue line was 3 times or 300% faster than the increase in the red line. If you take the difference, 2.7 trillion less 1.7 trillion, you get 0.9 to 1 trillion versus 0.6 in defense compared to 0.3 for a difference of 0.3, the 0.9 or 1 trillion to 0.3 trillion, 3 to 1 ratio. So while the president was correct during the first and second debates, that is, that he inherited 2 ongoing wars, he doesn't mean to suggest these wars caused the rise in the nation's debt and deficit, because if that were what he meant, then he would not be able to explain this graph or the previous 2 graphs. So if not defense spending, then what has been driving the debt's increase? You'll be surprised to learn it's never been about war, but love, babies of all things. In this graph, We have babies born charted between 1909 and 2005. The yellow shaded box denotes babies born between 1946 and 1964, known as the baby boomers because of the surge in births. It represents the largest number of births on the blue line. Note there are no higher peaks outside of the yellow box. In this next slide, we've repeated the blue line but added to it a purple line, which is the same blue birth line aged or extended forward in time 70 years. Do you see when this group becomes 70 years old? When the first babies of this group become 70 years old, add 70 to 1946 and you get 2016, Medicare goes bankrupt, indicated by the leftmost edge of our 70 years yellow box. Then in 2034, or the last year, birth boomers turn 70, add 70 to 1964 and you get 2034. Social Security is slated for bankruptcy. These facts are confirmed in these articles reporting the latest trustee projections for each program. So the aging of the boomers is of great economic consequence, affecting the viability of Social Security and Medicare when this group retires. But why is this? This is a 100-year graph of 1950 to 2050. The blue line is the number of people aged 20 to 64. The yellow is that portion of the U.S. population aged 65 and older, and the red line is the ratio of the one to the other, working aged 20 to 64 divided by the retired population aged 65 and older. In 1950, the number of workers to retirees was 7 to 1, and the ratio had its sharpest decline from 1950 to 1960. Then, from 1970 to 2015, although it continued to drop, be until 2015 that we see the next major decline, which again is around the time Medicare will go bankrupt, when the ratio continues to fall until bottoming out in 2035. Social Security goes bankrupt. Now, the ratio alone doesn't explain the full picture. However, it is clear that demographics or population shifts have contributed and will continue to contribute to the escalation in the U.S. debt, because two of the nation's largest social spending programs pay beneficiaries based upon age. In this 100-year graph, we simply want to state that many people have understood the economic trends that population shifts bring for many years. Notice U.S. GDP on this graph, the top gray line, moves into decline from 2010 to 2020. This was explained by the economist Harry Dent in his book The Great Economic Boom Ahead, in which he showed how the retirement of the boomers would lead to a 16-year depression, rivaling the Great Depression beginning in the 20-teens. So again, this information is not new. It's been well understood. Slower growth is anticipated for the U.S. economy in the coming decade and beyond, as indicated in this graph. As pointed out by Dent in his book, Britain's, Japan's, and Germany's population shifts have led to economic decline in those nations as well, as confirmed in this chart. The point is that these trends, these population shifts, have been clearly understood, and they are causing shifts in the economy that will make it more difficult for our nation fiscally in the coming years. We aren't headed for a repeat, therefore, of the booming 50s, 60s, 80s, or 90s. This means that we can't afford, as the President said, rightly, to return to any failed policies of our nation's past. The economic drivers of our nation have changed, which means we must exercise great caution economically, doing all we can to bolster whatever possible economic growth we can achieve. The last two reasons for the most recent escalation in the debt, and these are you're well aware of. The first is the $2.5 trillion in stimulus spending, and the second is expanded welfare rolls, which are up 42%, with over 100 million Americans today receiving some sort of welfare, federal governmental assistance. Have you ever thought about the fact that social spending programs are not constitutionally mandated and therefore entirely avoidable? Let's look at this next as we conclude this section in an effort to heed the President's warning to avoid the failed federal governmental policies of the past. As we wrap this up, think about what's gotten our nation into the economic mess it's in. It's really just been a series of decisions made by elected federal governmental officials that had poor economic results. All of these policy decisions were well-intentioned, but the problem is not intent, but result. And for the middle-class taxpayer today, that result which matters most is the economic result. Let's talk about the social spending programs first that have or will contribute to the nation's debt and deficit. First, we had FDR's desire to help the elderly poor, prompted by his big idea to create Social Security in 1935. The second was Johnson's desire to end American poverty, prompted by his big idea to create two more social spending programs, Medicare and Medicaid, in 1965. And then the third was Obama's desire to insure all Americans, which prompted his big idea to create yet one more social spending program, Protection and Affordable Care Act, or the Health Care Tax, or Obamacare, in 2011. It's important to note the four social spending programs we just mentioned, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the new Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, were made possible by President Wilson in 1960. Yet another big idea. This program was only possible because of Wilson's push for the 16th Amendment, which opened the door to his creation of the Revenue Act of 1916, which constitutionally enabled income taxation of all Americans. Without President Wilson's big idea to tax all Americans and his success in achieving his policy objective, the federal government would never have been able to financially sponsor FDR's social spending program of Social Security, or LBJ's social spending programs of 1965, or Obama's social spending program of 2011. Bottom line, if these men had not succeeded at instituting their big ideas, we would not be having this discussion, because the nation's debt and deficit would not exist, and neither would the 2008 crisis, which was yet another series of noble policy decisions with bad economic consequences that we covered in the first segment of this part 2. From this graph, you can see the rise in the nation's debt from 1980 to 2008 had been pretty steady due to population shifts that came before the boomers. Notice that the slope steepened in 2008. The first-year boomers born in 1946 turned age 62. Of course, this was also the year the bottom of the subprime lending boom fell out, leading to declining tax receipts and welfare rural expansion, and of course the $2.5 trillion in stimulus spending we noted earlier. The problem is this growth rate in the debt is unsustainable. The U.S. spent $2.5 trillion in stimulus money designed to stimulate economic growth. $2.5 trillion is 17 years worth of GDP growth. 17 years spent in under 4 years. In trying to think of ways to relate to this ratio, we thought of a couple of scenarios. The federal government spending $2.5 trillion when annual GDP income growth is only $150 billion is like getting a $5,000 pay raise and celebrating it by running up credit cards by $85,000. Or it's like spending $25,500 to get a $1.5 thousand raise. The disproportionate spending is a concern, especially when the CBO projects over 9% unemployment in Q4 of 2013 and a 0.5% decline in an already anemic 1% GDP growth rate. The U.S. has accumulated $6 trillion in debt in 4 years and will add another $6 trillion in 5 more years using White House projections, and that's with the $1.5 trillion increase in tax receipts. The $1.5 trillion tax receipt increase for the middle class would be equivalent to an average of about $6,300 per middle class taxpayer filed return. From 2013 to 2017, the U.S. will spend $12 trillion on entitlements, and that's just on Social Security, both meds, or Medicare and Medicaid, and income security. Our government will spend $3 trillion on defense spending, confirming our earlier analysis that defense spending is not our nation's problem. Annually, our nation generates about $0.15 trillion in additional GDP income and accumulates $1.2 trillion in additional debt. To give you an idea of scale, China adds $0.7 trillion to its GDP annually in incremental growth. So for every year America's labor force works to generate $0.15 trillion in additional GDP income, China's workforce generates 5 years worth of that amount in just a single year. At this rate of spending, we're adding to the debt 70% more than China generates in incremental GDP growth annually. The problem is China is growing and investing, so to what extent they have cash we can borrow is a concern. So think about it this way. There is only so much global cash available to invest, and it is earned at a particular rate. We are the world's largest economy, at least for now, and if we are spending at a rate that exceeds the global cash available, we will default. The other problem is that China is not technically an ally, so there are economic scenarios that some in our research have imagined where China might want something other than a devalued U.S. currency, given the Federal Reserve is printing so much currency through quantitative easing. So they might want something to fulfill our debt obligations other than just printed dollars. The most highly valued assets, some have argued, are our petroleum reserves. Most of these reserves are actually found on federal governmental lands. So there's a potential scenario that might result where the federal government would grant oil rights to the Chinese to drill on our land if China demanded those oil rights to keep us solvent. And we as American taxpayers probably wouldn't know about the situation, since we thought the Iraq War caused the nation's debt. The most disappointing thing in all of this, of course, is that least for the past 50 years, the present debt and deficit difficulties in funding Social Security, Medicare, and to some extent Medicaid that have stemmed from population shifts have been obvious. What's more predictable than babies born? Actuarial sciences haven't changed that much in the past 50 years. Can we suggest that an aging population, therefore, is a good explanation for the rise in the nation's debt or deficit? Shouldn't we have been told what this would mean in debt burden 50 years ago, or at least 20 or 30 years ago? What quality of governance have we been paying for? Now that we're on the eve of the election, everyone is telling us they're on the side of the middle-class taxpayer. But if they were, why weren't we told what these programs would do to our nation while there was more time to do something about them? See our 2012 election page on this site and watch Paul Ryan's videos on this subject. We're not interested in party lines, only dollars and cents. These videos are well produced, much better than this one. The animated graphics tell the story in very easy to understand terms, removing all the emotion from the subject so that the numbers are allowed to speak for themselves. Our question is, if everyone in D.C., on the evening news, and in Hollywood was truly looking out for the middle-class taxpayers like they say they are, then why did they let it get this bad? If they were really trying to help, to serve, and to protect us, then why didn't they insist on reform 50 years ago, doing all within their power to educate us on the issues? After all, they have the position and the influence. We don't. They have the ability to launch public policies and countless other means of notification they could have used to educate the American taxpayer, and this includes all of them: the one in the White House, the 435 in the House, the 100 in the Senate, and the 9 on the bench. 545. In our estimation, it's an example of gross negligence of their collective fiduciary responsibility to the American taxpayer and citizen. And now who is being asked to pay more? The middle-class taxpayer. Don't kid yourselves. Watch part 1 of this series. The numbers couldn't be more clear. There is no other entity or group to tax. So be careful, middle-class taxpayers, as you prepare for the upcoming November election. You have more writing on this election and the next 4 to come than you can possibly imagine. Exercise the greatest of caution, especially from whom you get your information. While it's somewhat vogue to be on the side of the middle-class taxpayer, as we mentioned earlier today, especially as we draw nearer to the election, how is it possible for television, news media, and entertainer one-percenters to claim business and Wall Street one-percenters are out of touch with the middle-class taxpayer, while the media and entertainer one-percenters are not? Both of these groups are part of the same income tax groups or tax brackets, so they're equally economically insulated from bad federal policy decisions, so that the media and entertainer one-percenters and the business and Wall Street one-percenters are equally out of touch. That ends part 2. Be sure to watch part 3, Energy Independence. Will show you why environmentalists will seek to embrace American big oil. When you apply for a job, do you want to work for a company with a management or owners who run up a lot of debt and have no cash in the bank to make payroll, or do you want to work for a firm where the owners and executive staff are incredibly successful, maybe they all drive Porsches, with a little debt and lots of cash in the bank? Where do you think you'd stand a greater chance of pay raises, promotions, or other career growth opportunities? Our federal government has been run by attorneys for the past 70 years who have collectively made enough bad fiscal decisions to create our present economic and financial conundrum. We wish we had more time to communicate the succession of bad policy decisions, all of which were completely avoidable. Watch our other video book presentations to get more information. The point is, as American taxpayers who need economic income to live and survive, we've been hiring lawyers with little, if any, economic or financial training to run the national economy. Isn't this a misalignment of skill and objective or need? Maybe we should try something different and put a successful person in the White House who's got a lot of money, who's made a lot of money, and who might be able to find ways to help us make a lot of money. Someone who understands finance and economics. Maybe that would stop the wealth stripping of the middle-class taxpayer. If you have a better idea, please let us know about it. We'll have our blog up next week. Go to www.thepublicsquaretoday.com. Thank you.